What is family? What are the traditions they have? What does the past tell us about who we are in the present? These are questions many encounter when analyzing their family's past. Almost all of us long, winding family trees that cover many generations and many continents, and hold within them stories of love, death, triumph, and tragedy. I am continuing to learn more about my family, and through my exploration of our family history, have found out many lingering questions. As I find out more about my relatives and their stories, I find that I gain a greater perspective of who I am. I am from many different backgrounds. I am Irish, Welsh, Scottish, British, Canadian, and most likely a little bit of other ethnicities. However, up until now, these have just been claims and stories. Not to say that I didn't believe them, but anyone can say anything about where they came from and who they are. However, this story is more than just about individuals, myself included. It is about family. What my family did when immigrating to America, the different customs they had, traditions they practiced, were all important to the story of who I am. Yet, it is larger than this. Family history is vital to study, as it truly encapsulates the story of us, the story of humanity over thousands of years. The journeys and stories of those who came before us give great context to the events of yesterday and today, and can help shape the future of tomorrow. My goal is to explore my two family branches. My mother's side of the family is primarily Irish and Canadian. My maternal grandmother has a family tree, with many generations mapped out, and it will be central to gaining a better perspective on who my ancestors were, what their names were, and other relevant questions relating to their experiences. Meanwhile, my father's side of the family evokes other questions. There have been many claims made about relatives on my father's side of the family, including being related to figures such as Revolutionary War Captain John Parker and abolitionist Theodore Parker. To my knowledge, there is not a family tree on my father's side, so exploring these claims will be more difficult. However, this does not mean it is impossible, which makes my journey to the answers about my ancestors all the more fascinating. I want to start with my maternal side of the family, as there is more documentation available to explore. My mother, Elizabeth White, is one of 7 children, born in Boston, Massachusetts in April 1963. My maternal grandmother, Bernadette Houston, was born in 1933, and my maternal grandfather, John White, was born in 1923. From here, the story gets complicated. As with any lineage, the further one goes back, the more people one discovers, and has to keep track of. Thankfully, in the case of my maternal side of the family, we have kept a family tree in order to track the many previous generations of the Houstons and Whites. My maternal family came from Ireland and Canada. The farthest back I could find was my maternal grandfather's side of the family. The first relative we found was a man by the name of James Aylward, who was born in County Kilkenny on December 15, 1825. Records indicate that the Aylwards lived in Kilkenny until around 1850. James Aylward emigrated from the parish of Glenmore in Kilkenny in 1850, coming to the United States and settling in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Meanwhile, the Whites had emigrated from County Cork in the 1820s and 1830s, also settling in Massachusetts. In 1891, Mary Aylward and Edward White got married, uniting my grandfather's side of the family. The White family was notable in Massachusetts through the creation of the J. F. White Contracting Company. Created by Joseph F. White in 1918, the company grew, and even though Joseph White declared personal bankruptcy during the height of the Great Depression, he still worked towards keeping the business afloat, which he did. Eventually, my great-uncles, Tom, Joe Jr., and my grandfather, John White, helped revive the business after all of them returned from serving in World War II. The company still exists today, but it wasn't the success of the company that interested me. Rather, it was the connection to my family and the relative success my family had after a couple of generations in their new country. Another notable relative was James F. Aylward, the son of James Aylward. James F. Aylward was a politician in the city of Cambridge, serving in many different capacities. These included serving on the Common Council, the Board of Aldermen, being elected chairman of the Board of Aldermen, and later serving as an assistant U.S. attorney. On top of this, he ran for other offices, including Mayor of Cambridge, United States Senator for Massachusetts, and also running to serve in the House of Representatives. While he didn't win any of the previously mentioned races, it is still remarkable that Aylward was able to serve and be relevant in Massachusetts politics for almost 4 decades. The story of my maternal grandmother's side of the family is just as fascinating. The Glavins lived in County Cork, eventually emigrating to Newfoundland. If Glavin sounds familiar, it is most likely because you are a baseball fan. Tom Glavine, the Hall of Fame pitcher, is a direct descendant of one of my grandmother's side of the family. This discovery shocked me. It's not every day one is related to a Hall of Famer. Another shocking discovery I made was that I was a third-generation immigrant from Canada. This brings me to the story of Elizabeth Glavin, my great-grandmother, and Daniel Houston, my great-grandfather. Daniel Houston was born in April 1904 in a small town called Outer Cove. The Houstons were primarily farmers and fishermen in Newfoundland. However, Daniel left Newfoundland when he was 18 years old in 1922, arriving in Boston to stay with his uncle. He and his uncle lived in a boarding house in East Boston, and Daniel soon found work as a fisherman, working in the port of Boston. Meanwhile, Elizabeth Glavin was born in June of 1904 in Fortune Harbor. She was one of 4 siblings. Her family had a shop in Fortune Harbor. However, like Daniel, Elizabeth left Newfoundland, moving in with one of her sisters who had a place in Boston. Eventually, Elizabeth found work as a telegraph operator and also worked in the St. Helena's House. The two met at a dance sponsored by the Newfoundland Club in Boston. This was in late 1931. When they married, Elizabeth was still not a citizen. What we found was that Elizabeth had gotten her citizenship in 1936, 3 years after giving birth to my grandmother, Bernadette Houston. These discoveries gave me a better perspective of who I was, but there was another whole side of the family to investigate. We then moved to my father's side of the family, the Parker side. As I stated, my paternal family claims to be related to many prominent individuals throughout American history, mainly Captain John Parker and Reverend Theodore Parker. But it is important to start with the information I already know. My father, David Parker, was one of 3 children and was born in Portland, Maine in 1957. My paternal grandmother, Jane Felton, was born in 1927, while my paternal grandfather, David Parker, was born in 1922. After talking with my father and my grandmother, I was able to make some incredible discoveries. Starting with my paternal grandfather's side of the family, the Parkers, I learned that indeed Captain John Parker and Reverend Theodore Parker were my relatives. For those of you who don't know, Captain John Parker was a militia leader during the Battle of Lexington, the first real skirmish in what would become known as the American Revolution. Besides being a militia captain, he was a farmer who lived in Lexington all of his life. He also served in the French and Indian War. Captain Parker died of tuberculosis around 5 months after the Battle of Lexington in September 1775. Meanwhile, Reverend Theodore Parker was a Unitarian minister and early abolitionist. Reverend Parker was an extreme abolitionist, advocating that Northerners should violate the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850 and supporting the efforts of John Brown. Reverend Parker would also die young, dying from tuberculosis in 1860 when he was 49 years old. Being able to recognize my relatives due to their significance in American history was an awesome realization, but I kept digging. My other early relatives included Lucius Parker, who was my great-great-grandfather. He was born approximately in 1865 in New Hampshire. Lucius was a farmer and married Mabel Parker, who was herself born approximately in 1870, also in New Hampshire. They had 5 children, including Walter F. Parker, my great-grandfather. He was born in 1893 in Roxbury, New Hampshire. He attended the University of New Hampshire in Durham. While there, he played football and eventually became the captain of the team. He graduated from the University of New Hampshire in 1915. After, he became a teacher, athletic director, and coached at many schools in Providence, Rhode Island. He was also an officer in World War I. Walter married Gladys Davies Parker, my great-grandmother, approximately in 1920. Gladys was an immigrant, moving with her family from Wales in the early 1890s. When her family moved, her father, David Davies, worked in the city of Boston as an engineer. He worked on steam boilers. Walter and Gladys had 2 kids, but tragically only one survived, that being my grandfather, David Parker, who was born in 1922 in Providence, Rhode Island. While I thought the Parkers were early settlers, and they were in some regard, I was surprised to learn that my paternal grandmother's side of the family had arrived in the 1600s. The Feltons settled on the North Shore, setting up what would be known as the Felton Farms in Peabody, Massachusetts. The earliest settler was Nathan Felton Sr., who left England and settled in Massachusetts in 1633. Later relatives from the Felton side of the family included S.A. Felton, who started the Felton Brush Company in 1872. Eventually, there was James and Doris Felton, who married and had my grandmother, Jane Felton. One final aspect of my paternal side of the family that I want to note is a tradition I have with my grandmother. Every first of the month, my grandmother and I call to wish each other Rabbit Rabbit. I've been saying Rabbit Rabbit on the first of every month for as long as I can remember. My understanding is that it is a British tradition to say the phrase Rabbit 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 on the first of every month to guarantee that good luck would befall the person who said it for the rest of the month. I don't know what happened to the third rabbit, but it may be a Parker family twist on the old tradition. Either way, it is something fond that I share with my paternal grandmother on the first of every month. Every one of my relatives has a unique story of their own, and if I had more time and more resources, I could do my own project on every single individual from both of my families. However, this didn't stop me from learning a great deal more about my family and in the process, myself. It didn't matter whether my relatives arrived in America in 1633 or if they created a successful contracting company. Rather, all their stories were fascinating and in combination literally put me where I am today. Without any one of my relatives, I wouldn't be me.